Welcome back to another episode of this show where I am trying to read a book from every genre, every subgenre of a genre. This is sort of my way of exploring new books. I find that when I tend to just choose something to read, I would fall into a certain category. I would read the same type of books over and over again. It's also very daunting to just go to the library without a plan and try to pick out a book. You end up picking books that are just like completely random, and it gets super stressful when it shouldn't be. So this is the little goal for myself where I'm trying to read more and read different stuff. In the end, I'm hoping to discover perhaps my favorite genre, my favorite subgenre, my favorite writer. So this first season, I'm exploring the realms of fantasy. There's a lot of subgenre to fantasy. In my previous episode, I read American Gods by Neil Gaiman. It's a really fun book, and I put it in the category of contemporary fantasy. I didn't know much about that book, let alone the TV show that followed it. But I do know a lot about this book that I have in my hand right now. It's Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. I think we are all familiar with this story by Lewis Carroll. I saw the cover on the library page when I ordered it, and I was like, this looks like a kid's book. I hope it's like in novel form. But it is the novel. It just comes with a whole bunch of pictures with it. And see, this is what I mean. I wouldn't have picked out this book by my own accord if I wasn't doing this project. Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, I am dropping it in the category of fairytale fantasy. It can get a little confusing understanding the difference between fairy tales and fantasy. So fairy tales are a subcategory of fantasy. Alice's Adventure in Wonderland of fairy tale fantasy is that Wonderland itself is this like giant scope world building. It doesn't happen just locally. It's not like a folklore. So another funny thing about Alice's Adventure in Wonderland is that it could be categorized in another genre as well, and that is literary nonsense. It's actually a very interesting genre when you think about it, where it has stuff that makes sense and stuff that doesn't, and it just plays with logic. The brain works in interesting ways, and I think non sequiturs and nonsense kind of help us understand ourselves a little bit better than the logical stuff. So I've never read this book. I've seen the Disney version, and I've also seen the Johnny Depp version. I haven't seen the Into the Looking Glass movie. I don't really plan to. But yeah, this is a book I've been meaning to get around to. I'm kind of excited that it's illustrated. I haven't read an illustrated book in a while, so I'm gonna get to that. I'll talk to you again around the halfway point, check in, see how I feel about everything, and go from there. So it's been a week or so since I've started Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. I'm about halfway through. It's been a busy week. Haven't done as much reading as I wanted to. So my thoughts about this book so far. It's a children's book. I'm not just saying this because I'm reading the illustrated version. It really does at times feel like a children's book. It resonates as a children's book because of just how Alice behaves, her childish thoughts. She spends a lot of time trying to, in a way, impress people. She's trying to remember memories from her life or a piece of poetry. And I think that's something we all do, isn't it? We try to impress people with our intelligence, and naturally we always come across looking a little sillier than we want to. Literally, like what is happening right now is probably coming across as that, because I'm trying to seem smarter than I actually am. So that's something I really relate to, is how childish we act sometimes. Another behavior of childishness is how naive we are. There's a scene at the beginning where she picks up this bottle of liquid and thinks, like a very intelligent thought, I should check if this is poison. She looks at it and it's not labeled poison. So naturally she thinks it's okay to drink. It's a naive thought, thinking that no one in the world would try to trick you. people are all honest. So then there's the idea of offending people. Near the beginning, she is surrounded by all these birds and a mouse, and so she started thinking about her cat. And she thinks about her cat, and she started talking about her cat, and started talking about how her cat kills birds, not realizing that she's offending her audience. So I think that's something we don't realize sometimes, is how other people's experience sort of impacts what we should say. I think as we grow older, we sort of recognize it a little bit better, but not always. I very often find myself with my foot in my mouth, just because I think like, oh, everybody thinks like me. Everybody loves what I like. Everybody has gone through the same experience as me. I say something and it's like, oh, everybody disagrees with me. And this happens both ways, right? And we see this when Alice sits down with the Mad Hatter and the Hare, and the Mad Hatter and the Hare just says these random things like, oh, are you thinking of getting your hair cut or something? And Alice gets offended. She's like, that's a personal question. You can't ask that. So it's like, what is Alice's relationship with her hair? You know, it's more about her than what the Mad Hatter says. This is a fascinating book, full of nonsense. And I think the beautiful thing about nonsense is that us as humans, we try to make sense of nonsense. It's just what we have to do. It's like, why did Lewis Carroll write this? Why? What was he thinking? What was like the thing he was trying to explain to us? What is it? Is it an allegory for drugs? I don't know. I think what I get out of this book as a writer is that if you could put some nonsense in your book and you craft it in a way that's really interesting, it becomes a little puzzle for people to solve. Leave it open-ended. Don't answer it. Why is a raven like a writing desk? That is a riddle the Mad Hatter asked, and it's supposed to have no answer. But we still think about it. We still try to give it an answer. I think that becomes a tool a writer can use if they use it effectively. So that's my takeaway through the halfway point of Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. I'll check back with you guys in maybe about a week or so, maybe less than that. It's a pretty short book. And we'll talk more. I'll have my conclusion, my final thoughts. Wow, that was fast. Seems like I was just talking to you. So I finished reading Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. Overall, this was a very different experience than I anticipated. I guess I'll start with what I think about this piece of work as a whole. I think it's less of an allegory for drugs and more of a metaphor for being a child. It's being a child trying to understand a world they have not experienced yet, an adult world, essentially trying to understand the idea of a courtroom or a large social gathering. As an adult, I guess it's kind of hard to think about the world like a kid. And I think that's what makes this book kind of interesting. I don't mean this to sound insulting, but like a child was telling the story. So it really captured that. So it's really interesting. One of the surprises I had with this story is how different it was than the other versions that I was used to. Pretty much the Disney version to me is the standard. That's the one I grew up with. That was the first time I was exposed to the story. Yeah, and it's just so much of it was different. I didn't know there was a scene with a griffin and a mock turtle, whatever that was. Additionally, I thought some characters would have more page time, namely the Cheshire Cat. You sort of get this impression that it was a very significant character when you watch the shows, but I guess not. It just kind of shows up like all the other characters and leaves. And I just realized how much weirder the book is than the movies, because I think with a book, you could always get inside the character's head, whereas in the movies, you just can't. So there has to be more logic in a movie, if that makes sense, so it can't be as weird. This book is pretty weird. I think if you're gonna watch the movie, you have to read the book at some point as well, just so you could have an idea of how they actually got to the movie, like what inspirations they took and left behind. I find that fascinating. So I guess what I'm trying to do now is quickly compare it with the previous books I've read. I've only read one book so far. Before this, in the reading all the genre experience, the previous one was contemporary fantasy represented by American gods. Did I like this more than American Gods? To be honest, it's almost about the same. It's about the same. Where American God lost me was at the end, and I feel like where Alice's Adventure in Wonderland lost me as well was near the end. It felt so abrupt that way. I was expecting more, and I guess it's my own expectations that spoiled it for a bit, but I'm going to give it to Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. I'm going to give it the top spot right now. I see myself reading this book again in maybe 10 years. I do. Anyways, I hope you continue following me along as I try to read every book in every subgenre there is, and then give my impression of it, give my experience of reading that book, I guess. This was Fairytale Fantasies, and that's Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. I like it. That was fun.